All right. Hello and welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. My name is Dustin Smith. And if you've been watching on the YouTube, the last time that I taught was last year, and I was slowly working through the book of Daniel for a couple of reasons. One, because most people just tend to not know what to do with the book. They don't know how to situate it in its original context and to understand what it actually meant to that original audience, and how we can actually take that and apply it to our lives today. And I also did it because I know a lot of people are very interested, because Jesus obviously draws upon the book of Daniel in several important ways. Jesus takes the reference of the Son of Man and he applies it to himself as a title. Obviously, there are a lot of visions about the kingdom of God, and after going through the book of Daniel, I had several people say, okay, well, that's nice. Yeah, we could see that Daniel um, had a purpose in its own time period. But what do you do when Jesus talks about this abomination of desolation figure that seems to be in the future? He talks about that in the Olivet Discourse. And I said, okay, I guess apparently if I'm going to make my case of Daniel, I also have to talk about how Jesus uses Daniel in the Olivet Discourse. So if you aren't familiar, the Olivet Discourse is the discourse that Jesus gave on the Mount of Olives. And that is in our three synoptic gospels in Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. We're obviously not going to be able to look at all three of those accounts. We would be here for 3 hours. So I just picked the most popular one, which is Matthew 24. And we'll look occasionally at the other two in order to make sense of this. But um, there's another issue with the Olivet Discourse that I really wanted to touch on in today's teaching, and that involves the relationship between the destruction of the temple, which Jesus very clearly predicted, and also the second coming of Jesus. And there are entire prophetic systems, there are entire prophetic views that try to answer those questions. And so we'll talk about some of those, and I'll tell you which ones are wrong. And well, I'll try to persuade you which ones are wrong. And I'll try to offer what I think makes the best sense of the evidence. And if you know me well enough, you'll know that I am strongly against beginning with a particular theological package and then using that as like the lens that I put on so that I can read the Bible through that lens. I don't like starting with a particular view and reading the Bible. I like starting with the Bible and developing my view. Now, most people don't know that they're beginning with the view and reading into the Bible until you tell them that they're doing that. So anyway, so we're going to try to accomplish basically two things today. We're going to try to figure out how Jesus is going to use or maybe reuse the book of Daniel in a new context. And we're going to try to figure out the relationship between the destruction of the temple and the return of Jesus. So that's a monumental task. We'll do the best that we can with it. So I will share my screen and we will, Lord willing, take a good stab at it. All right. All right. I hope everything looks good right now. If not, I'm sure someone will nicely yell at me. Okay. So I just thought I would give a title to this. Oh, okay. I thought I would give a title to this, Jesus' use of Daniel in the Olivet Discourse. Okay. Here's a picture of the Wailing Wall. If you go to Jerusalem, there actually is a piece of the wall, the original wall that was there during Jesus' time, that still stands at some point, and a lot of Jews go there to pray because, and that's the wall where the temple was located in some sense, or at least it was part of Jerusalem, but it's very, very old. It's over 2,000 years old. Okay. All right. So before we actually look at the text, and we'll be in Matthew 24 today, so you can take your Bibles and turn to Matthew 24. I want to begin by talking about some of the popular prophetic views of the Olivet Discourse, okay? And maybe you were raised and told that one of the particular views I'm going to look at is the view that you're supposed to take and read into the Bible. And so I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but I think it's okay for us to maybe have our presuppositions re-examined if we haven't taken the time to do so. So the most popular view that I found among biblical Unitarians is called the futurist view. What is the futurist view? Well, the futurist view is going to say, and this is in regard to how futurists would read this particular passage. Of course, they have ways of reading Daniel and Revelation and Second Thessalonians 2, but the futurist view is going to say that the destruction of the temple, the second coming of Christ, and the end of the age are events that will take place in the future. And by in the future, I mean as of January 2024, all of those events are still in the future. And since there is no temple in Jerusalem right now, this would require that a third temple must be built there in Jerusalem. Okay. So one of the questions you're going to have to ask is, when Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple, when did that take place and when was that fulfilled? And of course, if you are a futurist, you're going to say that hasn't been fulfilled yet, even though there isn't a temple yet. So and by a third temple means a literal temple. They don't mean the body of Christ. They mean a literal brick and mortar temple that is located in Jerusalem. Okay, now the full preterist view is a different view. It's kind of like the opposite view. And they would say that the destruction of the temple, the coming of Christ, and the end of the age are events that took place back in 70 AD. Okay, can you believe that? These people actually believe that Jesus has already come back and the end of the age has already taken place. And some of them will even say that the resurrection of the dead has already taken place. Okay. Well, you know, I can look around and I can tell you, there's still quite a bit of evil going on in this world. So I'm not convinced of that, but they have biblical reasons why they think that is true. And there are people that will look you straight in the face and they will say, yes, Jesus came back in 70 AD. Okay. I'm not convinced. I think that is 100% wrong. And there are some variations to this view, people that would call themselves partial preterist. But the shared view is that basically the Olivet Discourse would have been fulfilled in 70 AD. Okay, that would be, whether you're a full preterist or partial preterist, you're basically going to say that everything that we're going to read today in Matthew 24 has already taken place, already in history. Okay. All right. Now, this view is not really a prophetic view. This just sometimes pops up in liberal scholarship. And this is just what I'm going to call the misunderstood Jesus view. And so they're going to say that Jesus predicted that he would return when the temple was destroyed, which actually took place in 70 AD, but his prediction did not come true. So Jesus, of course, did say that the temple would be destroyed. It did happen, but in this view, the return of Jesus is linked to the destruction of the temple. And guess what? Jesus didn't come back in 70 AD, so Jesus was wrong. I mean, they actually have to say that Jesus made a failed prediction. Okay. Now, I'm not ready to go that far in my view of the Bible, but there's something that is in common with all three of these views. And if you've been paying attention, you would have made this connection already. And the thing that kind of links all these views is that they connect two events. They connect the destruction of the temple and the return of Jesus. And they say that when one happens, the other one must also happen. Okay. And so I'm actually convinced that all three of these views are wrong because they connect two things that were never intended to be connected in the first place. So that's me laying my cards on the table. And again, if you hold one of these views, again, I'm not trying to be rude to you or anything, but I'm going to lay out my case and then you can tell me where I'm wrong. Okay. All right. So things to keep in mind when we're reading Matthew 24. And of course, when you're reading the parallel in Luke 21. So I think that to begin with a particular theological view and to read it into the text is what's called eisegesis. Okay. It's not exegesis. Okay. So exegesis is where you're beginning with the text and you're reading out of it and you're developing your views and your theology and your ethics out of the text. You're not beginning with some sort of presupposition or some sort of doctrine and reading it into the text. Okay. So at least on these popular views, 1 and 2 are views that people subconsciously begin with, and then they read it into the text. Okay. All right. So we must develop our views from the text itself. rather than to start with them and use them as the lens through which we read the text. Okay. And the reality is that most of us don't know we're doing this. Most of us, we were taught certain doctrines or certain theological packages. Those that grew up with dispensationalism, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You were taught with that. You were taught that, and you were reading that into the text until someone came along and told you, hey, you shouldn't do that. So, okay, now, while Mark chapter 13, that's Mark's version, was probably written around the 60s AD, Matthew and Luke were written later. They were written between the 70s and the 80s AD, meaning, and this is really important, that Matthew and Luke both lived through the events of the temple's destruction, and thus they both had direct knowledge of its outcome. Okay. And so you should, by the way, know, you should know that the most important event that took place in the first century, other than the death and resurrection of Jesus, is the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And that happened in the year 70. Okay. And so that's really important for you to know. And again, that's just good knowledge you need to have as a Christian trying to make sense of the New Testament. Okay. So that's something that I think we need to know. Now, and people can debate these dates, and I don't want to spend the time doing that there. These are kind of the general consensus among scholars right now. And if you want to know why I think those are persuasive, you can ask me afterwards, and I'd be happy to give you the reasons why I think those are true. Okay. All right. So I think the best thing to do is actually just to read like a little chunk of the text and to kind of talk about it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my trusty little pen here because we're going to do some marking up of the text. We're going to do some marking of the text. Okay. I need to move this out of the way. Can I move that over here? I can move that over here. Fantastic. Okay. All right. So this is the New American Standard Version. We're just going to read here starting with the first 6 verses because that's all I can fit on this particular page. All right. Here we go. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when the disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Okay. So what are they looking at? The temple buildings right there. Okay. All right. And he said, who said? Jesus. Jesus said to them, he said to the disciples, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Okay. All right. So here's the question that I want you to start to think about. I'm circling a phrase here. These things. What are these things in the context? Answer: the temple buildings. Clearly, obviously. Now, I want you to remember that, okay? Because Jesus is going to continue to use this phrase, these things, in a very specific way throughout this particular discourse, this particular sermon, I guess you could say. All right. So Jesus is saying, look, these things, namely the temple buildings, they're all going to be destroyed. Okay. You disciples from Galilee, you fishermen, you're looking at all these great buildings and you think that they're great. He says, and Jesus here, he predicts that this temple is going to be destroyed. I mean, he just left the temple after doing the triumphal entry and having to, pull out the whip and cleanse the temple, so and so. And he's basically pronouncing judgment on the temple. And here he's literally predicting that it's going to be destroyed, which is kind of a big deal because the temple is like, that's where God lives. God lives in the temple. It's God's address. You want to go find God, you go to the temple, you go to the Holy of Holies. Okay. All right. So as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, okay, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. All right. So again, we're going to circle this. It's kind of like on part of it there. So notice, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. So what I actually think is happening here is that I think that the disciples are actually asking 2 questions. Question number 1, when will these things take place? Namely, when will the temple buildings be destroyed? And question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. Now, this word for coming here, this is not a verb. Okay, this is the noun parousia, meaning the physical return in the presence of Jesus. This is the second coming. And notice that they rightly connect the coming with the end of the age. Okay, that's correct. The disciples are correct in doing that. Okay, and Jesus doesn't try to correct them and say that you're wrong. That's not going to take place. And notice, by the way, when Jesus comes back, that's the end of the age. Okay, notice he doesn't come back and take everyone off to heaven for a certain number of time, some sort of rapture thing. When Jesus comes, that's the end of the age. And if you are familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, you know that even at the very, very end of Matthew, Jesus says, "Lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." Okay, so that's kind of how Matthew concludes his gospel. Okay, so Jesus answered and said to them, okay, so Jesus is going to answer this question. He's going to begin his sermon. See to it that no one misleads you. And if you're listening to this, here's the thing. I want you to assume, just for the sake of the argument, I want you to assume that I, the teacher, I want you to assume that I am misleading you right now. And so I want you to be thinking critically, listen to the words that I say, and I just want you to assume, just play devil's advocate, that I am trying to mislead and to lie to you and to deceive you, because that's the only way that you're going to figure out which reading of Matthew 24 is correct. Okay. All right. All right. So why should we see to it that no one is going to mislead you? Jesus says, for, unpacking that statement, many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. Okay. So many will come and claim to be the Christ, and they're going to mislead not just a few, they're going to mislead many. Okay. Now, you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Okay, there's our other line there. Remember the end? What does the end mean? Right here. The end of the age. I'm just going to draw a little line to it. Okay. All right, so let me just kind of go through some of my notes here. All right, all the things that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out. Okay, temple buildings. The destruction of the temple buildings, that is in reference to these things. Okay. He says, don't you see these things? And the disciples ask, tell us, when will these things take place? Okay. So I'm making the argument to you that these things refers to the temple buildings being torn down. Okay. So they ask the question, when will these things take place? But they also ask the second question, what will be the sign of your coming, the parousia, and the end of the age? Okay. And as we're already seeing down in verse 6, Jesus is going to say the end, and that is kind of meant to be a shorthand for the end of the age. All right. So I think that the disciples are asking two questions, and I think Jesus is going to be answering the two questions in very different ways. Okay. And as you saw at the beginning, we saw that at least two of the most popular prophetic views and one of the liberal scholarly views presupposes that these two questions refer to the same time and the same event. Okay. I'm not convinced. You'll decide for yourself. Okay. Okay. So Jesus says, hey, there's going to be messianic pretenders. And guess what? Okay. In the first century and around the time when the temple, around the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, yes, we do have messianic pretenders. Okay. We actually learn about some of them in the book of Acts. Okay, the book of Acts actually will tell us about some of these persons. Okay, in fact, 100 years either side of Jesus, from the birth of Jesus, 100 years before and 100 years after, we can actually document about a dozen different messianic movements. Okay, so those that are the readers of Matthew will have been familiar with fake messiahs or messianic pretenders that have come up in their own lifetime. Okay. All right. So Jesus kind of says, hey, look, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but this is not yet the end. And remember, what does the end mean? The end means the end of the age. Okay. And remember, the end of the age is what is going to bring about the age to come. At the end of the age, that ends the present evil age, and that begins the age to come. Okay. I don't think anything I'm saying thus far is pretty controversial, but we'll see. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Verses 7 through 16. For nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must run away to the mountains. Okay. So what do we make of this? Okay. So let's start off here. Jesus kind of begins with, look, some general signs of political upheaval. Okay. But do these general signs actually tell us anything in regard to either these things, the destruction of the temple, or to the end of the age? And the answer is no. Okay. Jesus like, but look, they're just the beginning of birth pangs. Okay. And it's really unspecific. But of course, we know that, there were wars. There was definitely a war between the Jewish people and Rome. Okay. That was the biggest war that was taking place there around that particular time period. Okay. All right. Now, here's something that's really, really interesting. And it took me a while to realize what was actually going on here. So notice what Jesus is saying. Jesus says that they're going to deliver you over. They're going to kill you. They're going to hate you. People are going to fall away. There's going to be betrayal and you're going to be hated. And you know what's interesting is that within a few days of Jesus giving this sermon, all of those things happened to Jesus. All those things. Jesus was delivered over. Jesus was killed. Jesus was hated. We had people falling away. Jesus was betrayed by Judas, okay? And he was hated by the Jewish people and by the Romans, okay? And it's actually easier to see because in Mark's version of the story, when Mark records all these things happening, you can actually take the specific words in Greek and you can see how they reappear in Mark chapter 14 and Mark chapter 15. Mark deliberately frames it as Jesus being the one person who actually embodies all these things that Jesus predicts are going to happen to his disciples. Okay. I just thought that was super interesting and super fascinating. Okay. We're not going to have the time to look at all that right now. That's just kind of a study for you to kind of do on your own. But the best is actually to start with Mark's gospel and to see how Mark does that. So the point there is that Jesus saying all these things are going to happen. And you think to yourself, okay, that sounds pretty terrible. But anyone reading the gospel is going to know, wow, all those things also happen to Jesus. Oh, it looks like Jesus is the one person who represents us. Okay. So we'll just leave that aside. But to me, I just think that's super fascinating. Okay. All right. But Jesus says the one who endures to the end, remember, what does the end mean? It means the end of the age. The one who endures to the end of the age will be saved. Okay. So let's make sure that we get that circled right there. Okay. Now, of course, most people are just going to endure to the end of their life. Okay. But remember, we've already seen Jesus define this phrase, the end, as the end of the age. Okay. So yeah, bad things are going to happen, but you've got to behave. You got to be faithful. You have to endure to the end. This is a huge killing blow to the once saved, always saved camp, which obviously I know I'm preaching to the choir here. He says people are going to fall away, meaning that you can actually fall away from the faith and you have to endure. You got to be faithful. You got to be loyal and you got to behave. Okay. And then we see that the gospel we preached and then the end will come. The end of what? The end of the age. Okay. So again, we're just going to highlight that point right there. So you see what's going on here? Jesus defines the terms at the beginning in the full sense, the end of the age, and then he uses this sort of like shorthand throughout it. And he's assuming that you're able to kind of connect those things and put them together. Okay. Most people don't do that. Okay. We got to learn to read this very, very carefully. Okay. So, all right. So yeah, Jesus has now told us a couple of events that are related to the end of the age. but nothing quite yet in regard to when these things, namely the destruction of the temple, are going to take place. Okay. So we know that you've got to endure to the end. Okay. But that doesn't really tell us any events, but he says that the gospel needs to be preached to the whole world, and then the end is going to come. Okay. That's really the only events, or the only event that we actually have there. Okay. And guess what? We can participate in that preaching the gospel. And not only can we, but we should. We actually should. In fact, the end of the Gospel Matthew commands us to go and make disciples and to teach them to obey or to observe all that Jesus commanded, and that Jesus will be with us to the end of the age. Okay, so there in verse 15 is the main thing we want to talk about. So Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, the A of D, which was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay. All right. So what does he mean by this? Okay. So notice that the author has kind of jumped in here, and he has actually said, hey, by the way, you need to let the reader understand what's actually going on. Well, if only we knew exactly what he wanted us to understand by that, but he's definitely saying, hey, there's something here you need to know what's going on. We don't get that with other quotes from the Hebrew Bible. We don't get, when New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, you don't normally get the narrator jumping in there and saying, hey, let the reader understand something special is going on right here. Okay, so let's pause on Matthew 24 and let's look back a little bit at this phrase, abomination of desolation, and the ways in which it was used before Matthew 24. Okay, so for those that actually sat through the Daniel series, all of this is going to be reviewed. So basically, the phrase in some capacity appears 4 times in the book of Daniel. Okay, and we know this because you can actually look at the Greek there in Matthew 24, and we have this word for abomination, vlebdigma. It's this really awkwardly sounding word. And you can see that it was also used in the Septuagint translation of Daniel. And so we know we're able to connect those words in a meaningful way. So Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation 4 times. So let's define these as best we can. So the first time is in chapter 8, verse 13, where the question is asked, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? Okay, so what is the holy place in this context? The holy place is the temple. It is the temple. Okay, and there is a particular thing here. It's instead of the abomination that causes desolation, we have the transgression that causes horror. Okay, basically the desolating, or the desolation that is causing horror. But right here, the transgression that causes horror, that's a thing. It's not a person. That's actually a thing. And we saw that when we put Daniel in its context, that this is referring to a pagan altar that was set up in the Jerusalem temple, and it affected the regular sacrifice. It kept the regular sacrifice from taking place. Okay, so that's the first occurrence. Chapter 9, verse 25, it talks about he, namely Antiochus, he is going to make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. That's for a 7-year period. But in the middle of that week, he's going to put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, so he's going to halt the actions in the temple. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Okay, that one, of course, is Antiochus. Okay, but notice the one who makes desolate, that's a person, but the abominations, or the wing of abominations, those are things that are taking place. Okay, so the abomination of desolation there, that's a thing that a person sets up, but the abomination of desolation is not a person. Okay, in chapter 11, verse 31, it says, forces from him, namely forces from Antiochus, will arise. They will desecrate the sanctuary fortress, that of course is the Jerusalem temple, and they will do away with the regular sacrifice. We've seen that before. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. Okay, so you got the abomination of desolation, which is a thing that is set up in the sanctuary fortress that halts the regular sacrifices, but it's distinguished from the him, the person who brings these forces to come and do this. So again, the abomination of desolation is a thing that is set up by a person, but the abomination of desolation is not a person. And lastly, the last occurrence is in chapter 12, verse 11. It says, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there's going to be 1290 days, which is basically 3.5 years. That's, of course, the middle of the week where it was all put to stop. You can see that here. You can see it's called the regular sacrifice is abolished. And the thing, the abomination of desolation, is set up. Notice it's a thing that's kind of erected. It's this pagan altar that's erected there in the Jerusalem temple. Okay, so from Daniel's standpoint, if you just had Daniel, is the abomination of desolation a person or is it a thing? Answer, the abomination of desolation is a thing, and it was set up in the Jerusalem temple in the year 167 BC. And we know this because Jews who celebrate Hanukkah remember this every single year, and they've done it every single year for over 2,000 years. Okay. That's just Daniel. All right. Now, what about the earliest Jewish interpretation of Daniel? Okay. So First Maccabees comes after Daniel, but before the writings of the New Testament. Okay. So we have our earliest Jewish interpretation to kind of give us a little bit of clarity. How are Jews understanding Daniel? Yeah, I'm here in 2024 trying to interpret Daniel, but I'm really far away in distance and time. What do the earliest Jewish interpreters say? So First Maccabees is a Jewish retelling of the history that took place. And what's interesting is that the author of First Maccabees is going to quote the Greek from the book of Daniel. So in chapter 1, he says, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege. It's the same Greek term as the abomination of desolation. Okay. Where did they do it? On the altar burnt offerings. And they also burnt altars in the surrounding towns of Judah. One more passage in chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. This is when they had cleansed the temple. The Jews had grown strong from the arms, supplies, and abundant spoils that they had taken from the armies they had cut down, that they had torn down. They had torn down the abomination that he, Antiochus, had erected on the altar of Jerusalem. Okay. So again, the abomination is a thing that someone put up. Okay. So in the historical work, First Maccabees, which quoted Daniel and commented on the events of the Maccabean revolt, the abomination of desolation is still a thing, not a person, that was placed in the Jerusalem temple. Okay. Now, what is going on with Jesus? Okay. Jesus is saying, hey, this is something that's going to happen in the future. Okay. But we can't just ignore all of that history. All that stuff happened. All that stuff took place. Okay. It might not be familiar to us as American Christians because it's not part of our history, but that was part of Jewish history. It still is part of Jewish history. Okay. So Mark is the earliest account that talked about the abomination of desolation. Okay. So there's something interesting in Mark's version, and I'm going to point out a couple of interesting points here. Okay. So in Mark 13:14, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he should not be. Okay. And that's because this verb for standing is actually a masculine participle. And if you can't read Greek, you'll never notice this. Okay. And the interesting thing that's going on here with Mark is that the abomination of desolation in Greek is actually neuter. It's a thing. But Mark wants to tell you that even though it's a thing, it's actually a masculine person that is actually now standing. The abomination of desolation is now a male person standing where he should not be. Okay. And then he says, when you see this, those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay. So immediately right here, I see Jesus doing two things. One, he is taking something in the history of the Jewish people that had been around, at least from that time, for 200 years. and had been celebrated on an annual basis for 200 years. And now Jesus is saying, okay, something like this is now going to happen in the future. That's the first thing that he did. The second thing that Jesus is doing is that he's saying a thing in the past is now going to be described as a person in the future. Okay? But here's where people get this wrong. They start with Jesus and they see Jesus talking about a person, and then they read all that back into Daniel and they ignore all the Jewish history and they assume that everything that Daniel's talking about is a person and not a thing. And you can't do that. You can't do that. It's not how it works. You have to let each individual author define its own terms and make its own point. Okay. So Mark was written first, and then Matthew used Mark as a source. Okay. So is Matthew, how does Matthew take this version of Mark, and what does he do? Remember, Matthew is writing after the destruction of the temple, so he's able to maybe clarify a couple of things so that the readers can understand some stuff, because Matthew has the, not only is he telling us the prediction that Jesus made, but he also has the benefit of hindsight. So notice what he says here. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken through Daniel the prophet. Okay, so now we've got this extra thing right here that wasn't there in Mark. Okay, standing in the holy place. Okay, so now we have a location, but there wasn't really any, there was no debate about the issue of the holy place. Okay, so now what Matthew doesn't do is he doesn't have this verb here, this verb standing. He doesn't turn that, he doesn't keep the masculine participle, because if he did, what is the nearest antecedent to this masculine participle? It's Daniel the prophet, and he didn't want to confuse you and say, like, it's Daniel standing in the holy place. Okay, so he's just going to use the neuter participle, meaning the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Okay, so Matthew gives us some more information. He tells you, by the way, what's interesting here is that Mark's editorial remark of let the reader understand, Matthew just copied that. Matthew's just like, I'm going to keep that as well. Okay, but Matthew helps you to understand it by letting you know, by the way, the abomination of desolation, that's what Daniel was mentioning. Okay, and by the way, we're talking about an actual temple. Okay, there was no debate. We all knew that, by the way, a holy place, that obviously is in reference to Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple. Okay. And of course, he says, just like Mark, when you see it, run to the mountains. Okay. Now, I don't think that Matthew is trying to say that it's no longer a person. I do think he's referring to a person, but you can see here Matthew gives us some more information. Okay. And then Luke, look what Luke does. He just says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her, namely Jerusalem, her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So what Luke did, Luke had Mark as a source. And Luke saw this abomination of desolation, and he just said, that's these armies right here. Sorry, it's just a really bad, it looks like I'm a Sunday night football commentator, and I'm giving you a really, really bad football play. Okay, but hopefully you're able to make sense of it. So Luke takes this phrase abomination of desolation, and he says, look, this is just surrounded by armies. And again, if you were living through the events of 70 AD, and you know that the Romans had multiple legions surrounding Jerusalem, you know exactly what this is talking about. There's no other thing it could refer to. It is the most obvious thing. It was the biggest, most pivotal event in Jewish history that had taken place in a long time. Okay. And it's actually called the Jewish War. Okay. So here's the key thing that I want us to take away, at least in regard to this question. Originally, in Daniel, the abomination of desolation was a thing that Antiochus Epiphanes put into the Jerusalem temple in the year 167 BC. And Jesus says, do you remember that terrible, awful thing that took place? This terrible thing. Well, something similar to that is going to happen in the future, except in this new reiteration, it's going to be a person. That's what Jesus is doing. He's taking this symbol that the Jews knew about. And it was this disgusting, awful, sacrilegious thing. And Jesus saying, can you think about how terrible that is? Something like that is going to happen in the future. Okay. And so what I think Jesus is doing is that he reuses an old but familiar image to predict a new Roman destroyer. Because in the year 70 AD, after Vespasian becomes the Roman emperor, his son Titus became the basically the head general of the armies, and they were able to knock down the walls, and they were basically able to surround Jerusalem and to just like utterly slaughter hundreds of thousands of Jews. And they went and they destroyed the temple. They destroyed the temple, and you know, Titus went into the temple and like he wasn't struck dead or anything. I mean, he went in there and like he was the person that went in there and the temple was destroyed. Okay. So people in the first century knew who was this abominable person that went into the holy place. That was Titus. We all know that is. Okay. But so it's a person when Jesus is talking about in the future, but it's a thing, a non-person thing in Jewish history when Daniel talks about in the past. Okay. And we have to allow for both of those things to be true at the same time and not allow, you know, one to force the meaning of the other. Okay. All right. Hopefully that made sense. But luckily, if you've been keeping up with the Daniel series, then at least all the Daniel stuff and the Maccabean stuff is not going to be new to you. Okay. All right. So we still need to kind of deal with this issue in Matthew 24 about, okay, how can we make sense of these two events? You know, how can we differentiate between the destruction of the temple and the coming of Jesus and the end of the age? Okay. All right. So we're picking up here. All right. So remember, Jesus just said, hey, whenever you see this terrible image standing where he's not supposed to be, get out of town, get out of Dodge. Okay. Whoever's on the housetop, don't go down to get the things that are in the house. Okay. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Okay. So Jesus doesn't know. He's just like, pray that it doesn't happen this way. For there will be a great tribulation. Notice a great tribulation, a terrible time, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life will have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, and notice the context here is people living in Jerusalem. Like if you're on a housetop in Jerusalem, you know, if you're, you know, you want to make sure that it's not on the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath they close the walls in Jerusalem and you can't get out. Okay. So the context there is the people in Jerusalem, because Jesus is obviously looking at Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. So if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Okay. So notice there, even the elect can be misled by false Christ and false prophets. Okay. And look, they could do signs and wonders. Okay. So the occurrence of miracles does not actually prove that God is working. See the book of Exodus, to where Pharaoh's men could actually turn their rods into snakes. Okay. So what do we get from this particular passage? Okay. He says a lot, but actually there's not a lot to kind of answer our questions in regard to trying to figure out when will these things take place and what is the end of the age? Okay. So what we do need to know from history is that when Titus, okay, surrounded Jerusalem in March of 70 AD, it basically became nearly impossible to escape. Okay. I mean, he surrounded it, and the purpose of surrounding it was to block all food and water from getting into Jerusalem. So the point is they said, okay, we're just going to starve them out. And that's how we're going to defeat them. Okay. And so the Romans, they kept all food from entering into Jerusalem. And by September of that same year, okay, they breached the walls and they killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And Josephus, who lived through this whole thing, he actually recounted 1.1 million Jews killed and 97,000 sold into slavery. Okay, so when he's saying here that, look, there's going to be great tribulation, and unless this had been cut short, no life would have been saved. I mean, from that time period, there had been no other moment in history when over 1 million Jews were killed at a single moment. It's a terrible, awful thing. Okay. So it's something to consider. And in fact, it says that the road to Jerusalem was just lined, Josephus tells us, it was just lined with crosses, and they just crucified all these people that tried to rebel. And the Romans just kind of flexed their muscles, and they said, look, if you're going to rebel against us, this is what's going to happen. It was a terrible thing. Okay, so Jesus goes on. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he, that's the Christ, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Or, behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Okay, so right there. Now we actually have the noun, okay, the coming, the parousia of the Son of Man. Okay, and Jesus is saying, look, if someone has to tell you, like, hey, Jesus is out there in the wilderness, like, you didn't see him, but he's way out there, don't believe him. If you think that he's like hidden in some sort of room, don't believe him. He's like, look, it's like lightning. Okay. When lightning happens, you see it. It's visible. He says, as lightning flashes, the Son of Man is going to be, it's going to be visible. It's not going to be hidden. No one's going to have to tell you that, oh, hey, Jesus came back, and if you just look in the right place, you'll find him. That's what he's trying to say. All right. He says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Okay. And it's probably not a coincidence that the vulture or the eagle was kind of this symbol of Rome, that of course gathered with all of this death. Okay. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, and then we have these sort of cosmic signs, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. This, by the way, these are what are called earth-shattering events. Okay. They're just typical apocalyptic language, meaning that there's going to be political upheaval, there's going to be wars, there's going to be downfall of kings, but it's not meant to be a meteorological report. Okay. We were just reading actually the other week, and I don't have my physical Bible here. It's actually downstairs. But at the beginning of 1 Kings, it's talking about how David's about to die, and he's about to hand over his throne to Solomon. But Solomon is not the next in line. Solomon is actually like the fourth in line. I think at that point it's actually the third in line, because the firstborn had rebelled against him. And it says that at the time when David handed it over to Solomon, it says the earth split, just so casually. The earth split, because that's the sort of language that you use when there's change in power with kings. Okay. Anyway, I saw that, and I was like, that is super interesting. Okay. It's just casually there at the beginning of 1 Kings. Anyway. All right. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Okay. So that coming right there, that's actually the verb. It's not the noun. Okay. So it's actually the Son of Man coming. Okay. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Okay. So we have the coming of the Son of Man, which Jesus says the coming of the Son of Man occurs at the end of the age. And at that point, Jesus is going to send the angels and going to gather up all the Christians. Okay. They're going to be gathered together. It doesn't say he's going to take them to heaven. He just says that's when they're all going to be gathered. Okay. Clearly, that's going to be a visible event that everyone's going to be able to see. All right. And of course, this happens after the destruction of the temple. Okay. All right. So the coming of the Son of Man, which remember is linked with the end of the age, it's not going to be some sort of secret event or something that's hidden in the wilderness or in some sort of room. No, it's going to be like lightning flashing from the east to the west. It's going to be visible, and it's going to be accompanied with political and worldly upheaval. I mean, we literally talk about earth-shattering events, even though the earth-shattering events don't actually take the earth and shake it. Okay. All right. So, of course, he's going to return with power and great glory, gathering the elect with his angels. Okay. All right. So now both events have been revealed without collapsing the two into a single event. There probably doesn't need to be a closed parentheses there. So that's my mistake. Okay. So I think that in the midst of everything that Jesus has been teaching here, I think he distinguishes between the abomination of desolation and the destruction of the temple as one thing, and a different event, meaning the coming of the Son of Man and the end of the age. I don't think that he says those are the two same events. Okay. But a lot of people like to link them. But let's keep reading and let's kind of see why they do that. Okay. So Jesus is now shifting a little bit from his discourse to a parable. He says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Circle that line right there. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour, the day and hour of the second coming, nobody knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Okay, so again, let's look at what's going on here. So this verse right here where it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. What people do is they think that all these things must be every single thing that Jesus has been talking about from verse 1. But I don't think that's the case. I think that when he says these things, he's referring to the destruction of the temple, because that's the way that he's been using that language consistently. Okay. And again, we can see here that this generation is not going to pass away, meaning a generation, 40 years, not going to pass away until all these things take place. If Jesus died in the year 30, and Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse a couple of days before his death, then 40 years plus 30 is 70 AD. Jesus predicted this exactly to the date. Okay. So Jesus is able to predict when the temple is going to take place. But can Jesus predict his own second coming? He's quite clear. He says, I don't know what it is. He said that day and hour, nobody knows. The angels don't know. Prophets don't know. He says, I myself, I don't know. Only the Father knows. Okay. So again, when it comes to the timing of these things, I think that the timing of them demonstrates that they're not one and the same event. They're two separate events, because the reference to these things, Jesus says that's going to take place within a generation. But when it comes to the second coming and the end of the age, he says nobody knows. Okay. They can't refer to the same event. They can't. Okay. So again, I'm just being very, very careful to define what does it mean with these things. Okay. Now, what someone will come back and they'll say is like, well, what about the previous verse? Okay. Where he says, so too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Okay. Now you could say, well, he is the abomination standing right at the door. But I do think it's still talking about Jesus. I do think, to be fair, it is talking about Jesus. Okay, yeah. So Jesus saying, yeah, when these things take place, yeah, he's right there at the door, but he still doesn't know when it's going to be. He's like, yeah, it's near. Like, it looks like bad things are going to happen. Okay. So yeah, you're going to be hoping for the Messiah. You're going to be looking for the Messiah. There are going to be all these messianic pretenders out there trying to say, I'm the Christ, I'm the Messiah, and they're going to deceive a lot of people. So yeah, you're going to be looking for the real one. And Jesus, he's not far away. He's not the absentee landlord. He's not completely distant. He's like, I'm near. I'm right at the door. I'm close. Okay. But the reality is, Jesus doesn't know when he's coming back. He doesn't know. He knows when the temple's going to be destroyed. Okay. But he doesn't know when he's coming back. Okay, so when you see these things, remember, formally describing the events surrounding the temple's destruction, then Jesus is right at the door. And this generation, remember, generation is 40 years, is not going to pass away until all of these things, remember, these things refer to the events surrounding the destruction of the temple, until all these things take place, okay? So I don't think all these things include the second coming. And of course, if Jesus died in the year 30, and a prediction of his 40-year generation becomes true in AD 70. And of course, from the perspective of Matthew and Luke, who are writing after those events. They're writing their gospels, and they're writing from the perspective of saying, look, Jesus predicted this and it came true, which gives legitimacy to the teachings of Jesus for their own communities. Okay. But of course, the day and the hour of the coming, Jesus does not know. That doesn't stop people from trying to make end time timelines, but for that very reason, I will never take those people seriously, and you shouldn't either. Please don't give them your money. Okay, so how did the initial readers understand Matthew 24? Okay, so if Matthew wrote sometime between the 70s and the 80s, then that would mean that Matthew lived through these events, okay? Matthew used Mark as a source, and Matthew clarified things from Mark's gospel based on what took place during the year 70. Matthew, who lived through the events of AD 70, knew full well that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, meaning that Jesus' prediction came true, okay? However, Matthew also knew that Jesus did not return. That's obvious, okay? Matthew, and here's the thing, Matthew adds to Mark by telling all these extra parables immediately after this discourse that summon the readers to expect the return of Jesus in the future. And you're not going to do that if Jesus had already come back. So look at what happens right after this discourse in Matthew's gospel that's not there in Mark. So still in Matthew 24, Matthew says, "Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions." Okay. So again, if you're watching this and you think that Jesus came back in 70 AD, why would Matthew add this and write this to his community to encourage the readers of Matthew to continue to be doing things looking forward to the return of Jesus? And because look, the reward is that Jesus is going to put them in charge of all his possessions. Did that happen in 70 AD? Obviously it didn't. Let's look at another one. In the next parable, the parable of the 10 virgins, the conclusion of this one is to be on the alert then, for you don't know the day or the hour. So not only is Jesus saying that I don't know the day and the hour, he says now you don't know the day and the hour. Okay? And Matthew would not have put that in there if Jesus had already come back. He wouldn't do that. He's like, look, you need to still be on the alert. Okay? And then later, in the parable of the talents, it says, after a long time, okay, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, "Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I've gained 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Okay, so again, another parable saying, look, the master is going to come after a long time, not something that's already happened in the past. He's going to come back in the future. He's looking for people to be faithful with that which they've been entrusted. And he's going to say that they've been faithful with a few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many things. All right. And they get to enter into the joy of the master. And then the following parable is the parable of the sheep and the goats. One of my favorite parables. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Did Jesus do that in 70 AD? Did Jesus come back and sit on his glorious throne? I don't think so. You can go to Jerusalem right now. Jesus ain't there. All the nations will be gathered before him. Did that happen in 70 AD? Nope. And he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, okay? He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Okay? Was there a scene of judgment between the righteous and the unrighteous? And then the king, notice previously he was a son of man, but when the Son of Man comes and sits on his throne, now he's a king. The king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." That didn't happen in 70 AD. Come on. So look at all of these extra little parables that come right after this in Matthew's versions, not in Mark. Matthew adds it to make sure that, hey, look, the temple was destroyed. Jesus predicted it, okay? That means that Jesus is a true prophet. He's the Messiah. If he was true on this, then we also know that we can trust that he is going to come back. There is going to be a second coming. He's going to bring about the end of the age. And so what is our response? We need to be faithful. We need to be found doing. We need to take what we've been entrusted with, and we need to do well with it. Okay. We need to be called good and faithful servants. And we need to be, of course, the sheep that Jesus puts on the right. Okay, so how can we apply this to our lives today? I got 3 applications for you, 3 ways that you can take Matthew 24 and you can apply it to your life this very day, right now. Number 1, Jesus predicted that the unfaithful in Jerusalem would suffer punishment, and many from that generation lived to see this prediction come to fulfillment. And this would have served as a stark warning and reminder for Matthew's readers to remain faithful to Jesus without compromising, lest they too end up with a guilty verdict. So from their perspective, they can see Jesus made this prediction, it happened, and it led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people. Jesus predicted that was going to happen. And so if Jesus makes those true predictions, then I don't want to be found guilty. I better be faithful, because Jesus means business. Okay. And if Jesus can bring judgment even in my own lifetime, then I better be loyal, better be faithful. I better be on the straight and narrow, better follow the terms of the new covenant and the Sermon on the Mount that are elsewhere in Matthew. But you can see there, it's like having lived through that, they could look at the Olivet Discourse and they can learn from that. And it would be a reminder and a warning to, to shape up and to get on the straight and narrow. Number 2, the Olivet Discourse shows one of many ways in which the New Testament authors reuse Old Testament passages for brand new purposes. And so we, as interpreters and readers of Scripture, we must work diligently to respect the context of all authors of Scripture, allowing for the possibility that inspired passages can be used again in brand new circumstances. Again, the abomination of desolation in Daniel was a thing, not a person. But Jesus reuses it for a brand new purpose and says that terrible, awful thing that happened in Jewish history, it's going to happen in the future. It's going to happen within a generation. And instead of it being a thing, now it's going to be a person. And he can do that because Scripture is inspired, and because it's inspired, it can be used to shape and teach God's people in new contexts and circumstances. We have to respect it. We have to respect the New Testament authors when they do that. Number 3, Jesus calls us to be ready for his arrival. Seeking first the kingdom involves the active use of our talents and gifts. It involves faithfulness to his teachings. It involves moral clarity and a posture of alertness. And this is what we have to do. We got to be ready. We got to be faithful. We can't just be sitting back like this, relaxing. Blessed are those whom the master finds doing. All right. That's what I have for today. I think we've been going for a little while. I think I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll open things up for questions. So if you're watching this, we'd love to have you available for Biblical Unitarian Fellowship. Check us out in the description of this video for ways to get in contact with us. We'd love to have you so that you can bless us with your gifts and your talents and that we can minister to you as well. Thanks for watching. Be blessed and have a great day. Cannot find the end button.